First thing is this: are they that different in terms of? I want to just get across, as much as I am breaking them down for the purposes of the presentation, I think it's very rare that you will have a debate on the developing world where you don't end up talking about both. Because even if the debate is about economic development, I think there's an awful lot of arguments to be made about how social development underpins economic development and vice versa. So if you're having a debate about women's rights, you can talk a lot about how economic development will underpin that. So I think that's something very important. So I think it's a case of, regardless of which debate you get, you can make arguments from both, and I think it's really about how arguing one underpins the other, and I'm going to go on and flesh that out a little bit in a second. So I say here, so how does economic development underpin social development, and how does social development underpin economic development? Don't want too far. Okay. Economic development underpinning social development. I think there's an argument here about, I'm going to give you a sample argument, which is one which I've heard come up literally 1,000 times in debates before. If you've been to international competitions, people have made this argument so many times. If you're ever going to take an argument, write it down on a piece of paper and just have it ready to pull out of your bag and use. I guarantee, like I've went to a Worlds where I use this argument in 3 separate debates. And it's the argument about how if you develop a middle class in a country, that will lead to social development in our country. So it's a case of, the argument would be, do you want to, we'll say, tie development aid in a country to the development of women's rights? So you may want to turn around, this is an argument for, I suppose, for one side of the debate, and you can argue the other side as well. But it's a case of, if you want to make the argument, so saying, look, let's forget about women's rights, we should just focus on the development aid and so forth, or whether it's, it could be a sanctions debate is another thing that will come up and I'll talk about in a while. So it could be an argument against sanctions and just giving money. The argument you can trot out an awful lot of the time is this idea that if you, it's a very cliched argument, but it's actually one that can be quite effective, is the idea that if you give money to these countries, inevitably, even if it's a dictatorship and so forth, fine, some money may get filtered off, but if there is economic development, even if it's that, if there's very little progress in the short run on the social front, what you will see is you'll see the development of more people getting jobs, you'll see the development of a middle class in that country, people getting more education, so if you've got more money, you're more likely to spend that on your kids' education and so forth. So as there is more money floating around the economy, what does that get spent on? So it's a case of, the money gets spent on things like education for their children, they may spend money on satellite TV and get exposed to international ideas, may get access to the internet and so forth. So it's a case of that money, and when families have that kind of money, I suppose tend to be more what we would describe as a middle class in those countries, they tend to become, I suppose, exposed to the kind of ideas that would lead to the development of rights within that country as well. So if people have access to the internet and watch TV, they may realise that maybe women shouldn't be just kept in the home. So it sounds simplistic, but it works. There's also arguments you can make then, is that this sort of argument, because it's coming from within the country and because of a fundamental change in the attitudes of the country, it's more sustainable in the long run rather than the change which has been imposed from the outside. You can also say there's other things as well, is that when someone's dirt poor, they generally don't tend to take as much of an ownership over their society. They don't get as politically active and so forth as when they actually feel like they have something to lose. So even if they don't spend that money on anything particularly valuable, someone has to, if people feel like they've got something to lose, they're more likely to actually advocate for saying, no, I want elections because I want to change the way my government is doing something. So it's a case of people will become more politically involved. And there's also things, so I don't know why I'm saying health there. Increased wealth also provides other spheres of power and influence other than government. So it's a case of, in developing nations, the problem a lot of the time is that you have the government, which makes all decisions. It may be that you don't have, for example, companies who will influence policy, like domestic companies who will try and influence policy. You may not have, let's say, the development of any sort of people donating to NGOs within their own country, or you may not have, for example, churches may not be that powerful because they may not have as much money and so forth. But the more money that floats throughout the economy, we'll see other, I suppose, spheres of influence is the way I put it, growing up. It might be trade unions, maybe, as the economy develops, which can, I suppose, push the government into doing particular things because they're not the be-all and end-all in the economy anymore. So I'm not going to spend much longer, I'm not going to spend any longer on this argument, but I think I wanted to, I suppose, give you the idea of the structure for it, but use it. Find a debate to use it in, practice it, throw it out there, and let it get attacked, see how people attack it, and if ever there was an argument, which I'd say, have an A4 sheet of paper in your bag, and you can pull it out, and guarantee there's very few major international competitions you'll go to where you won't end up using it once. And it's one of the most common ones, so I want to spend a little bit of time on that. I'm going to take a sip of water from my vase. But it's nice and cold, so I can't complain. Okay, social development underpinning economic development. The second argument then is that you can argue the reverse, and you can say it's actually more important to prioritize social development. And the example which I give here, I suppose it's a case of there's lots of angles which you could take depending on the debate. There isn't as generic an argument as there is for the other side, but like the examples I can give is that, like, so should you tie development aid to women's rights? You can say that, look, even if you care more about the economy than women's rights, it's a good idea to prioritize pushing women's rights, because getting more women active in the workforce is actually going to be good for the economy in the long run. There's lots of other arguments you can make in that regard about women's rights and how that underpins it. But democracy, for example, tends to lead to more investor/consumer friendliness or confidence, as well as an enhancement of other institutions. So if you've got democracy, the odds are they will strengthen courts, they will be more independent than under a dictatorship, and that's the kind of stuff that's important for companies wanting to invest in your country. So it's a case of, that's why I suppose democracy is important. And I'm going to come back to something else about democracy in a second. There's also an awful lot of the debates, as I said, minority issues are a big thing in the developing world. So it's a case of providing an advantage, whether it be affirmative action or just coercing them to stop killing their minorities, can often be a good thing. A good thing from an economic point of view, as well as all the other obvious ones, because it can help to bring about obviously the social stability stuff, which I'll come back to, but also it's a case of just more optimal economic performance, because you're probably choosing your doctors from 10% of all your population, or whatever it may be, or the top 10% of like your doctors and lawyers, as opposed to just a small elite minority. So it's a case of it's better in that regard. But the biggest thing, I think, in regards to, if you want to argue about any sort of a social issue and why it leads to economic progress, is stability. So it's a case of, if I am Pepsi and I'm trying to decide where to set up my next sugar factory for processing my sugary drinks, I am going to invest in a place that is predictable and stable. That is the #1 priority for companies, ahead of cost. Like, they just don't want the risk in an awful lot of ways. So it's a case of almost any of these things, you can argue that this leads to a more stable society, and that's what feeds into why they're successful. So for example, if you look at Africa, the countries which are the ones which tend to be the most developed are the ones which have been the most politically stable. So if you look at Botswana, for example, like one of the reasons why, like, there is diamonds as a factor there as well. But in addition to that, part of the reason they're well ahead of the rest, I suppose, of sub-Saharan Africa, other than South Africa, is because of the fact they've actually had very stable government over the last however many years as well. So stability is something that I think is worth arguing. So this is stuff where, and by the way, we can probably email around these slides or whatever later on, so you don't feel like you need to take down everything now. But it's a case of, this is just a template for ideas which you need to think about. So regardless of whether your debate is economic, whether your objective is an economic one, or whether your ultimate objective is to promote a social aim in the developing world, you can always argue both, and one underpins the other, and you can argue one underpins the other.
Do you have like the main example for each of the arguments? This one and this one?
Yeah, I can try. I probably don't have time to get into them now, because there's a lot of other stuff I want to get into. But there are certainly ones, I suppose, whatever it is, it's a case of stability. I was probably working backwards. I would probably say, if you want to look at Botswana, I think is probably a good example of where stability feeds into it. If you want to look at, let me think of a good example. Minorities, is a lot of argument for saying the breaking down of the caste system in India is something that's contributed towards their economic development over the last however many years, and it's been successful. Women's rights, more women in the workforce. No stunning example I can think of off the top of my head. I have to think about the other ones. But certainly there are lots of examples we can get into. I'm happy to put a bit more thought into it later on. Come up with more. Free trade. I wanted to just get into this because you can get free trade debates in a lot of ways. You can get it as a pure free trade debate in terms of, like, that this house, I think, give us a sample later on, believes that free trade is the best mechanism for developing the developing world or whatever. Or it could be something that would be more subtle. So it could be a case of, you might have a debate about WTO membership, or it might be a debate about agricultural subsidies. But at the core, they're all a debate about whether you should kind of be open to trade or closed to trade. Okay. First thing is this. I'm going to start with the pro side, and then I'm going to go through the anti side, because I think there's quite distinct arguments. But I want to give you some ideas of, once again, these are arguments that are worth having in the bag, and you can trot out at some point, depending on what the debate is. First thing is, there's an awful lot of empirical evidence done by various groups who've come out and said, and I don't think it's worth getting into them to a large extent, basically saying that countries over the last however many 50 years which have had open trade policies are more developed than those who've had closed trade policies. I'll come back to that in a minute when I'm talking about the opposite and what the responses to that. There's various ones. There's loads of examples you could give. You can look at South Korea. It's probably one of the most prolific examples of a country which has gone from kind of 0 to 100 in a very short amount of time. Vietnam is a country which has been very successful, I suppose, in recent years through opening its trade policy. You can look at which certainly isn't a developing country anymore, but is one which developed significantly through very open trade policies. You can also, I think, there's very distinct differences, I suppose, in South America, where if you compare it with countries which were, which I suppose, there are countries, for example, like Chile, I suppose, which had a very open trade policy, they developed a lot quicker than a lot of their contemporaries. Free trade, you can also argue that there are benefits beyond just the pure exchange of goods, and that it's a case of it advances long-term social and economic goals through knowledge sharing. So it's a case of if you have foreign investment coming into your country, Coca-Cola may set up a factory and they may, God forbid, hire women. Things like that, for example, may actually lead to advancing those ideas. And people say, well, look, Coke are doing it, maybe I should do it too. So you can have that kind of soft transfer of kind of rights and ideas and so forth. Someone may become a manager in Coke, go to Coke in the United States and start watching American TV and then come back and go, yay, we should have rights in courts and whatever it may be. I'm being kind of flippant here, but you get where I'm going with it, is that there's a kind of a very soft osmosis of kind of ideas that happens through, I suppose, free trade and interaction with other cultures as well. And also people who go to debating competitions, which is also good. But you also, I suppose, have it from a pure economic sense, is that if you have open free trade, you can do essentially what the Chinese and the Taiwanese have been great at doing. So it's a case of lots of Western phone manufacturers asked the likes of whatever Foxconn, HTC to build their phones for them. And HTC are making better phones than an awful lot of the Western companies are, because they've gotten that knowledge through manufacturing them in practice. So there's, you can say that free trade is something that can lead to the importation of knowledge as well into your own economy because you build up skills. And there's also, I think you can argue that a lot of the biggest economic issues to the developing world tend to be because there's not enough free trade. If you want to look at some of the poorest countries, the biggest problems for them are just completely dysfunctional agricultural markets. So I think you can actually argue that an awful lot of the reasons why trade is sometimes unfair are because of things like agricultural subsidies. And if you're arguing on a pro-free trade side, you can say, look, obviously we think that those should be gotten rid of as well. And we think that what we need is to move towards a world with less of these trade barriers, and that would get over a lot of the problems which we have at the moment. One way of solving it, yeah, maybe to close your agricultural markets completely. The other way is actually to say, no, we're going to go through a long-term transition to liberalising food markets globally. So this, you can argue it certainly from that perspective as well. The next one. Sorry, okay. Next one, pro-free trade. I'm not going to get into this, but it's kind of the economics-y stuff of, if people are familiar with comparative advantage, it's a case of like free trade is good because it allows your country to do what you're good at. So it's a case of if you have a big cheap labor force, you can utilize that to supply consumers in the West. If you are, whatever, in the United States and you're good at building like iPhones and whatever, then you can do that. I'm not going to get into that argument, but understanding, like, I suppose, kind of basic economic stuff, if you haven't studied it, it's worth spending a little bit of time reading maybe some sort of kind of an introduction to macroeconomics. Comparative advantage is kind of a useful thing to be able to argue. The other important thing as well is that free trade can be very good for developing nations because it can provide capital to exploit, I suppose, industries or resources which they otherwise wouldn't be able to happen, or which they wouldn't be able to do. So it's a case of if you have massive oil reserves sitting offshore, that can be pretty expensive from the perspective of either you developing the technology to be able to have the drills to drill down into the Gulf of Mexico or whatever it is, to whatever depth, can be very expensive, or just you just sometimes don't have the money. So it can actually be cheaper to say, look, Shell, come in, build